Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi, to Furina Ask Zajef! So as usual, for the Ask Zajef, I'm first gonna talk about the characters' overall place in the meta, how good they are, how valuable they are for an account, and then I'll start taking questions from chat that are more specific to either builds, teams, anything else. So, how good is Furina? A lot of people consider Furina to be the best unit in the game. Personally, I don't, but I don't think it's completely unreasonable. I think a lot of people consider Genshin's meta to be a lot more objective than it actually is. There are some things you can talk about objectively, like, for example, what is the team that has the highest DPS with X assumptions, right? That's something where you can reach an objectively true or false, I guess, answer. But how good is that team isn't an objective statement anymore. You can objectively say how much DPS it has, but things like how that DPS happens over time, whether it's front-loaded, back-loaded, sustained, things like whether all your damage is concentrated in one big hit, which can lead to losing a lot of DPS through overkilling enemies. These are also things that can objectively be stated, but the impact of those things is subjective. How much those things matter, how much those things impact your experience playing the team is a subjective statement. And because of that, any overall statement on how good a unit is are going to have a certain amount of subjectivity involved. And I want to insist on that point because while I disagree with people that say that Furina is the best unit in the game, I also want to make it very clear that Furina is definitely a unit that's strong enough that I think it's very reasonable to consider her the best unit in the game if the specific things you care about are not exactly the same as the specific things I care about. I guess in order to talk about Furina's place in the meta, I think it's really important to talk about how the meta has evolved since the start of Genshin. So, when Genshin started, we didn't have really good on-fielders. The only teams that we have that weren't awful were National, and that's it. On top of that, if you did National on one side, your other side was scuffed as all hell. After a bit of time, we got Child as a side grade / potential upgrade to National, followed by Ganyu, and back then, Freeze was really good, and enemies were very ventiable, so for a while, there was the Freeze Ganyu team, the Morgana team that was fairly popular. And then Hu Tao's release created a situation where you now finally had two good teams that weren't reliant on Freeze. You were now able to do a Child team, Child, Bennett, Tsuko, Xiangling, and a Hu Tao team with Hu Tao, Sing So, and then kind of double flex. Most popular one at the time was Zhongli Albedo. With more unit releases, Kazuha provided some potential upgrades to those teams. Ayaka provided you with the Freeze teams that was just generally outright better than Ganyu's Freeze teams. And eventually, Raiden's release also gave us some more team options. By the later half of Inazuma, we finally properly had units that allowed you to make two good teams. And then they released Dendro. And Dendro shook things up a lot. Dendro gave us teams that could reach similar, if not higher DPS than the teams that we'd previously had, while also being a lot easier to play and being able to reach a larger portion of that damage at low investment. Back then, back in 1.0, up to Dendro release and for a while after, I considered the best unit in the game to be Singto, because the best teams in the game pretty much all used Singto. If you look at carries released back then, there wasn't really a carry that was released that relied on a unit that wasn't Singto, that had a team that was really, in my eyes, better than what National was. And then when Dendro came out, that was even more the case, because there was now a team that could be argued to be outright better than National, but it was Double Hydro Hyper Bloom with Singto again. Had Furina been released back then, she would have been worse than Singto, because none of the units we had back then were that great with her, and really great enough to beat out the good Hyper Bloom teams. But then at the start of Fontaine, we started getting some carries that were actually good enough to properly compete with Hyper Bloom. Most of them still doing a bit less damage than Hyper Bloom at standards that are usually used for like non-whale TC. But those standards are a bit on the low side compared to what like a min-maxed account, even a non-whale min-maxed account is. And obviously, the higher your artifact standards, the more teams outside of Hyper Bloom benefit. compared to Hyperblue. When Furina was released, in my eyes, the only team that could make a strong argument for Furina to be a contender with Tsingtao as like the best off-field Hydro was Neuvillette. Pretty much every other team where you could use Furina, she was good, but those teams, in my eyes, weren't really good enough to justify being better than the Tsingtao teams, outside of the Neuvillette team. But then they started releasing more units that worked well with Furina. They released Nalia, which, while Furina isn't necessarily her best team, Furina was one of the great options for her. They released Klein, same thing. They released Gaming, which at the time, yeah, Gaming's best team was with Furina. They released Xianyun, which allowed the Luke teams to be good with Furina as well. And because what was pretty much unequivocally the best carry in the game at the time, Neuvillette, and a lot of the carries released right after Furina worked really well with her, it ended up impacting people's perception of her in a very, very positive way. People thought Furina was really, really good. And she was pretty damn good. And now, we're in Natlan. And in Natlan, we've gotten a few character releases, and most of them work with Furina, but not that well. Molani can function with Furina, but because Furina applies off-field Hydro, a lot of the time, in practice, you'll end up getting your Vapes yoinked by Furina, so she doesn't end up being the best option for Molani teams. With Kanich, you can play Burgeon Kanich teams with Furina, but you're generally not going to get as many E's on your Burgeon Kanich teams versus your Burning Kanich teams. And so, while they are good teams, some of the value that Furina's providing is kind of alleviated by the fact that Kanich himself will be getting less of his value. And then Furina was pretty strong with Chaska, but immediately after Chaska's release, we got Citlali, who's better, and while she can work with Furina, it's kind of optional. And we got Maoika, who also can work with Furina, but it's not anywhere close to her best team. On top of that, Citlali retroactively gave a lot of the carries that really liked Furina before new, arguably better team options. Pretty much all the plunge carries, at least the Pyro ones, want to use Citlali over Furina now. And they can't use both because plunges Shatter, and Shatter takes precedence over Melt when a Pyro attack hits a frozen enemy. Which means that unless they also have an underlying aura, which is kind of rough to get reliably, you'll Shatter, and then your Pyro won't trigger a reaction. It'll apply Pyro. But it wasn't just the Melt teams, it wasn't just the plunge teams. Pretty much every Melt team, or every Pyro carry that was good outside of Hu Tao, now has a team with Citlali that's at least competitive with Furina, if not just better. But then on top of that, even characters like Neuvillette are now a lot less reliant on Furina because, while Furina is still very good for Neuvillette, she isn't necessary. When you're playing Furina and Neuvillette teams, effectively what you're doing is you're sacrificing a bit of damage on your Neuvillette to get the off-field damage from Furina. And that's generally worth it because Furina scales with the same stats as Neuvillette, so if you have buffs that buff the whole team instead of only the on-field character, if they buff Neuvillette, they will also buff Furina. But you are sacrificing personal damage. The value you get from Furina's damage buff and Hydro Resonance is generally worse than the upper limit you can get from getting a third stack on Neuvillette on a character that provides something useful for him. Does that mean that Furina is not Neuvillette's best team anymore? No, she still is. But the non-Furina teams now have a lot more options than they used to. Not that Neuvillette really needs a good team to function, but the point I'm trying to make here is just the meta has evolved in a way where Furina is like one of the, I guess, least necessary strong units, at least when it comes to the very powerful teams. When you look at what the really strong carries are in the game, I think most people will agree that the big ones are these three, and the gap between these three and the next ones is pretty big. Some people will want to include Molani in there. I see why. Personally, I think that the quality of life issues are too big of a problem, but the reality is that Maoika teams are definitely far from optimal with Furina. Even with C1 Furina, the teams are worse than the C0 best Maoika teams. Same for Arlecchino. Neuvillette's best team is Furina, but Neuvillette is arguably the character who is the least reliant on the strength of his overall team to perform well. I know that a lot of people watch the Zajef Daily channel. It's not an official channel, it's just someone who posts stream highlights, but they posted a video like a month or two ago when I was talking on stream about what I considered to be the best 10 units in the game. And I had Neuvillette as the #1 unit. The main reason why I said that at the time, the main reason why I still think that right now, is because, in my eyes, when it comes to how good a unit is, overall, is a very subjective statement. The most important thing is how much their presence on your account gets you closer to getting your stars. How much them being on your account makes it easier to get 36 stars in Abyss. And outside of when Abyss is like heavily anti-Nevilette, which was the case last Abyss, with the Swanee on one side and like Omega Night Soul single target on the other, Nevilette, in my experience, tends to be the unit who single-handedly has the most impact compared to anyone else. There are many accounts that don't have Nevilette that struggle to 36 star, where getting Nevilette would make 36 stars trivial. There are many accounts that have Nevilette, and that 36 star, where if they didn't have Nevilette, they would struggle. And I think Nevilette is the unit for which there's the most accounts that reach those two criteria. And a good portion of the reason for that is because of how well he performs with throwaway garbage you don't need on your other team. I did a Nevilette clear with this team on either side of this Abyss, which, keep in mind, right? This is not a good enemy for Nevilette. 70% Hydro resistance is a lot. And we cleared. Nevilette is the character who's the easiest to make work in a random bullshit go, yeah. I was using units that an account that started on Lantern Rite with a Nevilette could have literally gotten in a day. And the main reason I decided to use Lanyan is because I was too lazy to go to the Mondstadt Statue of the Seven to get Animo MC. In any case, the point I'm trying to make here is just, while Furina is a part of Nevilette's best teams, Nevilette is arguably the carry who is the least reliant on being put in his best teams to perform well. Even a team that's pretty much as bad as it gets with throwaway units that don't have great synergy with him, just from getting VV and getting 3 stacks, he's kind of gonna be able to reach the Abyss DPS check. Even in single target against an enemy, a boss with high Hydra resistance. Although I will say, a new account won't be able to do that, because if the team that I used yesterday is the team you do, you will need a fast other side if you want the Swanee side to go well. But you can still understand the point, right? Obviously, if you were to play Nevilette like that, you would play him on the first side, not the second one, and you'd put your other team on the second side. Anyways, the reason why I think it's important to talk about this is because, in my eyes, Furina is a unit who is very good, but who has pull value that I think is very much overrated. Not because she doesn't help your account, but because generally the accounts that she helps already full star. Now, I've provided a lot of context for why I don't think Furina's the best unit in the game, but I don't want anyone watching this video to take away from it that I don't think Furina's good. The reason why I think it's important to provide this context as to why I don't consider Furina to be the best unit in the game is because I think it can be kind of harmful when units in a gacha game are overrated, when there's a certain perception in the community of a unit being must pull. It's why I generally stay away from the concept of must pull, because gacha games are inherently very predatory, and when you find yourself in a situation where everyone around you tells you that a unit is a must pull, but you don't have enough primos to get them without spending money, what you're effectively being told is you need to spend money in this game. And that's not a message I ever want anyone to get from any of my videos. In any case, now that I've provided the context I wanted to provide on why I don't consider Furina to be the best unit in the game, we can talk about the teams where she is doing a lot. So Nevilette, like I said, Furina is part of Nevilette's best teams. Your other 2 slots tend to be fairly versatile here. People generally prefer playing a team with VV plus Shilonen, or VV plus a defensive option, or VV on Lanyan plus Shilonen. With Citlali's release, we now also have Citlali as a potential option. If you have Nevilette and you don't have Furina yet, and you're asking yourself, should I go for Furina? What sort of situation will Furina not make that big of a difference in? Generally, if you already have something like these 3 units available, while Furina will improve the teams, she's far from necessary. I also think that people generally tend to really underrate a Hyper Bloom for Nevilette. The reality is that once you have one source of shred, getting a second source of shred is a lot less effective. I think people tend to heavily underrate teams like this, or with Kuki here. Same thing for this. Because the amount of damage you gain from the additional shred is good, but it's not as much as what you gain from the first source of shred, and the damage you get from having a bit of off-field hyper bloom damage is actually not that far behind. On top of that, that damage is less reliant on you not getting interrupted. If you don't have a good shield option available, it's something to consider. So wait, if you're starting from one of those Neuvillette teams that are like already pretty decent, getting Furina won't be that big of an upgrade, but it may allow you, if you're starting from this, for example, any of these 3 units can be replaced for Furina. So if you want any of these 3 units on your other side, getting Furina will be able to free them up. Hu Tao is one of the characters that suffers a lot from being a 1.x character. Not because old characters bad, but because pre-2.0, characters were not released with signature artifact sets. Outside of Maréchaussée, Hu Tao's artifact sets are pretty god-awful. By default, you tend to generally either use Crimson Witch, which only gets 1 stack of the 4-piece because she can only use her skill once, or Shimenawa's, which has a 2-piece that is really not that great, and which reduces the amount of burst you'll be able to use. Maréchaussée gives normal and charge attack damage, which is most of Hu Tao's damage, and a lot of crit. And Furina enabling Hu Tao to use Maréchaussée is a pretty big deal. Furina by herself isn't enough Hydro for Hu Tao to reliably get her Vapes, so you'll generally play her in double Hydro teams, either with Yelan or Xingqiu. And finally, your last slot is generally going to be a healer. You can use Bennett, Xilonen, or Xianyun as the general best 3 options, because it's very easy to get Bennett, and because Xingqiu is, at worst, very functional. Furina's performance in Hu Tao teams is reliably going to be an upgrade for them, almost no matter what you're starting from. Next, we can talk about Xiao. Furina also often tends to be an upgrade for Xiao, but it's not necessarily as big. Xiao already has a good artifact set in Vermilion, and he'll get an even better one soon. So he doesn't gain much from being able to use Maréchaussée, but Furina still offers a buff and some off-field damage. More importantly, the amount of damage percent you get from Furina is bigger for Xiao than it is on a lot of other characters, because you get to actually use a good healer. A lot of the good Furina teams use healers that only heal in single target, which leads to the amount of fanfare you're generating averaging really not as much as you'd expect. In Xiao teams, because you can use Xianyun, that's not the case. So you end up getting a higher damage buff from Furina than you do on a lot of other teams. On the other hand, Xiao gets a lot of damage percent from his burst, so that damage percent is more diluted. Because of that, while Furina is most definitely a great option for Xiao teams, she's not the only one. You've got a few options for Xiao teams, and Furina isn't necessary, but she will generally tend to be the one that performs the best. Outside of that, there's Wanderer teams. You can end up using Furina as your last slot with a healer here. Generally, the best healer here is going to be Bennett. I know some people use Mika because Mika generates more fanfare and gives attack speed. But the problem with using something like this is that you don't have resistance to interruption, and Wanderer is one of the characters that gets punished the most. From getting hit, because he has to fall all the way to the ground, so his knockdown animation is longer than other characters. And if he gets staggered while he doesn't have his dash, like his free stamina dash passive up, you can't dash out of your knockdown animation, which makes it even longer. But looking at just damage, this does tend to be the best Wanderer team. Other than that, Furina tends to be a competitive option for Chlorine teams, especially for people who don't have C6 Cheveleurs. When you have C6 Cheveleurs, Chlorine teams tend to just outright be better for the Cheveleurs ones, but without it, it's really similar. She's always at least a viable option for Navia, whether you're doing Navia double Hydro with Xilonen, Navia Xianyun, or just Navia Bennett. Furina, very often a solid choice. But similar to the Chlorine teams, she's not necessarily the best choice. Klee teams. Klee has the same issue as Hu Tao of having really bad options for artifact sets, and so Furina tends to be a bigger upgrade than on a lot of other teams. Noelle, maybe. Furina is a pretty major component of Noelle teams. And then the remaining characters aren't really characters where Furina is like an important part of their teams. A lot of them can use Furina, but it doesn't tend to be all that important for them. I think if you're going to take anything away from this video, I want you to remember this. The main question you should ask yourself when it comes to whether or not you should get Furina is, what team is she going to go into if I get her? And how much is that team going to improve from her presence? There are not many situations where getting Furina will upgrade your teams more than getting a 5-star weapon or constellations, or a constellation. But a lot of people prefer getting a new unit rather than a constellation on an old one, so that's not necessarily that big of an issue. But there's also quite a few teams where Furina is just not an upgrade at all. So ask yourself that question, inquire about your favorite characters' teams and how good they are with Furina, and make your decision from there. Before I start taking questions from chat, there's another thing I want to talk about with Furina, which is, I think, a pretty important misconception. People tend to heavily overrate the amount of fanfare you get in her teams. The average amount of fanfare that you get in Furina's teams is very, very often in the 30 to 40% damage range. The main reason for that is because there aren't too many healers right now that heal a lot in AoE. And what I mean by AoE healing is healing that applies even to off-field characters. If your healing only applies to your active character, it means you have to swap to them and get healed to generate fanfare from them. Right now, the healers that are used the most often in Furina teams are not AoE healers because AoE healers don't tend to be that good. The AoE healers that are used the most with Furina are generally Xianyun and Baizhu, and Xianyun is used in plunge teams and pretty bad outside of them, and then Baizhu has a lot of healing, but that's honestly the main reason why he's used in those teams. It's just because he front loads that fanfare more. And so those teams do still tend to be worse than teams where instead of a healer that just front loads fanfare healing, they gave you a bit less fanfare but do more themselves. Because of that, in practice, a lot of the good Furina teams tend to not average nearly as much fanfare as you would expect. Generally, when your healer is Bennett or Shilonen, you'll average somewhere between 30 and 50. If your healer is Xianyun, it's gonna be like 50 to 60. With Baizhu, it can be a little more because of Baiju's ability to use his E into Furina burst. Baiju's healing on his skill is delayed, which means that on Baizhu you can use your burst and then you can skill and then immediately use Furina's burst, and you'll get the healing from his skill after Furina's burst animation is over. Right now, I'm not on a very high healing build, so it was a little hard to notice, but his ability to do that means that you can front load fanfare on Furina without having to swap to your healer after her, which is actually kind of a big deal. A lot of the teams where Furina's good tend to have long uptime for their damage windows, and there's actually quite a few teams where Furina's burst expires before you're done doing your damage. Biggest example of that being Neuvillette. Even in the perfectly min-max Neuvillette teams, if you look at the GC Sim rotations and you go to the sample and you look at like what buffs are active at what points, even in those very like perfectly played rotations, Furina's buff tends to expire in the middle of Neuvillette's last charge attack. In practice, people don't tend to play perfectly, so Furina's buff will often expire in the middle of the third one, and the fourth one will be completely unbuffed. What that means is that the ability to swap your healer before Furina rather than after means that you don't have to spend as much time, you don't have to eat into her uptime as much before swapping into your carry, which is it's one of the things that Baizhu provides in these teams. But even in those teams, pretty much every team other than Neuvillette averages like at most 65, generally at most 60 damage percent from her passive, and most of them average a lot less. Obviously, a 30 to 40 damage percent buff is not bad, but because arguably the most important part of her kit is the damage buff, it's important to actually realize that it is not giving you 75% damage. She's not giving you 75% damage in any team. It reaches 75% in a good amount of the teams, but the average amount you're getting is a lot less than that. Anyways, now that we've talked about that, we can move into the actual Ask Zajef section of this. As a free-to-play, should I pull C1 Furina? As usual, when it comes to constellations on characters, I think it's important to keep in mind that you will never really need to have constellations to clear stuff. But if you're trying to min-max your teams and you're asking yourself if that would be a good use of your Primo Gems, we can talk about that. Furina's C1 increases her fanfare limit by 100 and also front loads 150 fanfare at the very start. In most teams, this is actually giving you more than 150 fanfare. You might see this and think, okay, so you started with 150 more and now you're capped at 400 instead of 300. So you're gaining on average, less than 150, right? Well, honestly, not really. Like I've said earlier, very often you end up either not capping the Fanfare bonus until a decent amount of time into your rotation, or just not capping it at all. And this front-loaded Fanfare generation also means that you're starting with Fanfare, and Fanfare gives you healing bonus, which means you also end up starting with 15% more healing bonus, which makes the following Fanfare generate a little bit faster. And so in practice, this very often is the equivalent of 150 more Fanfare, if not more. So it's pretty reliably a 35 to 40 damage percent upgrade for the whole team for the duration of Furina's burst. And that's pretty solid. Because Furina's a unit that, while not necessarily part of that many characters' best teams, is part of a lot of characters' viable teams at the very least. It means that all of those characters now have the option of playing Furina with an additional 40 damage percent. So, for a free-to-play player considering more vertical investment, Furina's C1 is definitely one of the better 5-star cons to consider. But don't spend money on this shit game. As we've entered Outland, we're getting more accessible sources of damage percent from things like Scroll and the Plunge set. If this keeps up, will that make Furina's buffs less valuable as they're less rare? Yes, but I would also expect the fact that, you know, new units are getting released, it means we're going to get more and more different types of units, which means we're very likely to see healers like Xianyun that have actual proper AoE healing that work in teams and team archetypes other than Plunge in the future. And so, while Artifact Set Power Creep is giving us a lot of sources of damage percent that dilute Furina's damage percent buffs, if we also get healers that can generate more Fanfare, we'll end up getting more damage percent, so that dilution will be offset. How scam is Tenacity on Furina? Tenacity on Furina is incredibly underrated. Almost every team that benefits from the Tenacity buff is gonna have better performance with Tenacity than Golden Troop. It's almost always really, really close. So it's not like you need to get yourself a TOM set, but if you have a good TOM set, it does mean you don't need to farm Golden Troop, pretty much, unless you're playing Nevilet. How worth is it pulling the 5-star healers versus Furina cons and just using 4-star healers like Bennett? Well, if it's a team that can use Bennett, most of the time it won't get much of an upgrade from replacing Bennett. So you'd definitely get better improvements from getting Furina cons over replacing Bennett with a healer. Yeah, it might be a downgrade. It often will be. Mostly I meant, is it worth getting Shilonen? Getting Shilonen so you can activate Furina's healing is only really something you should consider for the Geo carries, I guess. Like Navia and Ito. I guess Sino maybe. Monohydro. Hu Tao. When you look at Hu Tao teams, you will most definitely see better results from C1 Furina with Bennett versus C0 Furina with Shilonen. But if you want Bennett on the other side, then yeah, getting Shilonen will help. How much of a difference to Furina's damage does keeping your teammates over 50% make? A pretty big one. You gain 40% more damage, and this is multiplicative. So you gain 40% more damage from your teammates being high enough HP that Furina's consuming their HP. There's pretty much no team where she won't consume any HP, but there are a good amount of teams where you won't be consuming it from all your party members. The unit that the most often doesn't provide this buff to Furina is Furina herself. Because if your healing is coming from a unit whose burst you want to use after Furina, it means that unless you swap back to Furina, she's not benefiting from their single target healing. Mainly with Bennett. When Bennett is the healer you're using in your Furina teams, Furina herself will pretty much stay at 50% HP permanently past your first rotation. But you'll generally still have 3 stacks, so you don't lose that much. When should you use Furina's burst? At the start of your rotation or before your DPS? It depends. The main thing to keep in mind is that you'll get buffs from a lot of different sources, and as a general rule, you want your buffs to overlap as much as possible. So you should use your buffs with longer durations first, and your buffs with shorter durations last. The Neuvillette teams are interesting because in the optimal Neuvillette rotations, you have split uptime where you do 2 charge attacks, then swap out, then swap back in, and you end up spending a lot of time on Neuvillette. And in teams like that, if you don't swap out and back in, your buffs on like Kazuha, for example, will expire really early, which is sad. And so you end up wanting to swap back to Kazuha. But that means that you don't need Kazuha's buff to be used as early in your setup, and if you want Furina's buff to last for a long duration for your second uptime, you want to use it a bit later. But like for example, right, when you do a team like this, the optimal rotation is this. I'm not sure if you're supposed to use Kazuha burst. I don't know if you have time. right? And you end up using... Yeah, I don't think I was supposed to use Kazuha Burst. Either that or Shilonen Burst. Whatever. And so in teams like this, you end up using Furina's Burst right before you go to Neuvillette, because your other buffs you'll refresh for your second uptime, but not Furina's buff, so you want it to still last by the end of your last charge attacks as much as possible. But in most teams, you end up using Furina's Burst relatively early. How well does Furina slot in Freeze nowadays? Well, technically, this is a Freeze team, so pretty damn well. But I assume you're talking about Freeze with Cryo carries. It works. She's not necessary for Freeze teams, but she definitely does work. The biggest issue that Freeze teams have with Furina is that the nature of Freeze makes it synergize really well with groupers, because when you're in AoE, freezing enemies while grouped means that even small hits of AoE will always hit all of them. And because of that, you really, in Freeze teams, generally like using an animal unit that's a grouper. The cryo units we have that are supposed to be played in Freeze teams often benefit a lot from being played in double cryo, and the cryo healers that we have are not very good. Diona's healing is really low. Chala doesn't provide much outside of healing, and a lot of what Mika gives is buffs to physical damage. And because of that, Furina's not that great for Freeze teams. But the thing is, there's not a lot of Hydro units that are great for Freeze teams. If we had Hydro units designed to buff Freeze the same way Citlali can it be designed to buff Freeze, right? If you had a Hydro Citlali that gave Cryo Shred instead of a Cryo Citlali that gave Hydro Shred, you probably wouldn't give much thought to using Furina. But because the Hydro units we have don't have the best synergy with Freeze, then it means that you're gonna end up either using Furina because she's quite strong with a Cryo Healer that's not that great, or using a Hydro unit that's not that great for Freeze with a cryo unit that's good for Freeze. Or ditching your grouper, but then you're kind of losing the biggest benefit of Freeze, which is how it deals with AoE's content. Have you talked about ER requirements? I should. That's a good idea. So let's talk about Furina's ER. Sure. Furina generates 1 particle when her things hit, up to once every 2.5 seconds. The intervals aren't exactly consistent, so she's generally generating 1 particle every 2.5 to 3 seconds. That means that in teams with somewhat shorter rotations, she's generating less energy per time she uses Burst. First, let's talk about the worst case scenario for Furina's ER. Technically, the worst case scenario is going to be 30-second rotations that use 2 bursts, but I think we can mostly disregard those because most people don't play like that, even in teams where that's the optimal way to play. Outside of that, generally, the worst case scenario for Furina is going to be do a 20-second rotation, so as short as possible while still getting skill every rotation. She's the only Hydro unit in the team, and the rest of the team doesn't have a lot of energy generation. The most extreme example of that is going to be the C6 Bennett infused Xianyun plunge teams, like Diluc. So let's really take a look at that worst case. If she herself isn't on Fav, and for now, let's take a look at what happens if no one is on Fav in this team. You can do Fav Xianyun, but a lot of people don't. So for now, let's take a look. No one on Fav. That's pretty high. In a team like this, you should have her on Fav. It significantly reduces her ER requirements, and this is still somewhat achievable. Now that we've looked at the worst case, let's take a look at the, I guess, average case. Average case is gonna be Maoika, Bennett, Furina, Shilonen. Without Fav, ER requirements are at around 220, 230, because Shilonen is on Fav. If you have Peak Patrol, a lot higher. And then if Furina herself is on Fav too, your requirements go down to around 180. This is what the average case is. The problem is, the average case is gonna be teams where you're using Fav weapons on other characters most of the time, and if you don't have those Fav weapons, or if you have the signatures that are upgrade over the Fav weapons, then the ER requirements on Furina go up a lot. And then finally, you have the best case scenario, which is gonna be double Hydro with Neuvillette. And the reason why this is gonna be the best case scenario is because 1, rotations are longer, and 2, Neuvillette generates Hydro particles. So, let's take a look at a 26 to 28-ish second rotation, and that Kazuha's on Iron Sling, but even then, your ER requirements are already pretty damn low. Get a second Fav proc, even lower. funnel one of the Neuvillette E's into her, even lower again. What that means is that Furina's ER requirements vary a lot depending on the team, and I mean, that's often the case for supports. But as a general rule, almost every non-double Hydro team is gonna prefer Fav over the other 4-stars because the ER requirements are gonna be high enough that you get a lot of value from the Fav effect on top of the value from reducing the rest of your team's ER requirement. In the worst case scenario, you may need Fav plus ER sends. Generally, Fav with a few ER rolls is enough, but in the best case scenario, you pretty much need no ER at all. What that means is that because in some scenarios you need pretty much no ER at all, well, in those scenarios, not having to build ER means you can build a lot more damage. And that means that her performance varies a lot depending on your team. Her personal DPS in the best case scenarios is upwards of like 25 to 30k, but in the worst and average case scenario is generally not that much higher than 10k. But because of that wild difference in damage output, it also means that when her ER requirements are really low, when you end up wanting to use Fav on her, those tend to be the situations where TOM is the best set compared to Golden True, because she's doing lower damage anyways, so you're getting less of an increase from your artifact set because you're starting from a lower number, and you'd be better off just running TOM. Anyways, I think that's gonna be it. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope you learned a thing or two about Furina. At the end of the day, I like highlighting units' weaknesses when they're perceived very positively, because I think it's very important for people to know what they're getting into when they get a new unit, and it's really easy to overlook things when the overall opinion of a unit is positive. But that doesn't mean I don't think Furina's a good unit. She's still pretty strong. As usual, do all the YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.